The bells of Madrid rang that evening with a sound that seemed to split the air itself, an explosion of celebration, echoing off marble facades and winding through the labyrinth of cobblestone streets. It was the night Spain's most powerful man, Ferdinand VII, took his bride to the altar. Every church door stood open, every tavern brimmed with music and wine. The royal palace blazed with thousands of candles, their golden glow reflecting off crystal chandeliers and silken drapes imported from the east. From the outside, it was the image of splendor, but inside the mind of the man wearing the crown, it was something far darker. Ferdinand VII moved stiffly through the grand corridor, the long train of his ceremonial coat brushing the polished marble floor. His bride, Maria Isabel of Portugal, followed close behind, her white gown rippling like waves in the dim light. Her face was serene for the watching eyes of the court, but her gloved hand clung to his arm with a quiet tension, as if she already sensed something she dared not name. Behind them, courtiers whispered and bowed, their voices hushed but urgent, their smiles too fixed to be honest. The great doors of the throne room had closed hours ago, but the palace still breathed with movement, guards at every archway, servants scurrying with silver trays, musicians murmuring in the galleries. To the public, this was a union of kingdoms, a promise of stability after years of chaos. Yet to those who understood the shadows of Spanish politics, this night was something more fragile, like a candle's flame in a draught-filled hall. They reached the royal apartments, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow into the corridor ahead. The carved wooden doors of the bridal chamber loomed like the gates of a fortress. 2 sentries stood at attention, their muskets gleaming in the torchlight. Ferdinand dismissed them with a curt wave, and the heavy silence that followed pressed against the air. The king's hand lingered on the iron handle. For the briefest instant, his jaw trembled not from the weight of duty, but from something colder. The door swung open. Inside, the chamber was a masterpiece of opulence. Tapestries of hunting scenes covered the walls, their reds and golds deepened by the flicker of dozens of tall candles. The bed, an enormous, carved walnut structure, was draped in white damask, the fabric so fine it shimmered like ice. A fire burned in the hearth, but the heat did little to cut the strange chill that settled in the room. Maria Isabel stepped in first. She traced her fingers along the edge of the bed, glancing toward her husband with an unreadable expression. Ferdinand followed, closing the door behind them with a soft but final click. For a moment, there was only the sound of the fire and the faint, steady breathing of the newlyweds. But then a sound, sharp and sudden. It came from the far corner of the room. A thud, followed by a faint, almost human sigh. Maria's head snapped toward the noise, eyes wide. Ferdinand stood frozen, his hand halfway to the dagger on his belt. The king took one cautious step forward. The air felt heavier here, the candle flames twitching as though something unseen had disturbed them. The corner was shadowed, the tapestries swaying slightly as if from a draught, but there was no window open. "Did you hear that?" Maria whispered. He nodded slowly, scanning the shadows. But before he could move closer, a sound like a scream, low, muffled, and too close, ripped through the room. It was the kind of cry that chills the spine, too human to ignore, too strange to understand. Maria gasped and backed away, her hand clutching the folds of her gown. Ferdinand turned sharply toward the wall, searching for a hidden panel, a concealed door, anything that might explain the sound. His eyes were sharp, almost feverish now, darting from corner to corner. And then, silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. The king's own heartbeat pounded in his ears, his fingers trembling against the hilt of his dagger. He glanced at his bride, her face pale, lips parted, her posture rigid with fear. Slowly, he let go of the weapon. He told himself it must have been the wind, a settling beam, some trick of the senses. But deep down, he knew it was neither wind nor wood. He turned toward the bed, meaning to speak, to calm her. But then he noticed his own hand. A smear of red glistened against the white lace at his cuff. It wasn't wine. His throat tightened. He flexed his fingers, as if the act might erase the stain. but it was stubborn. Maria saw it too, her eyes locking on the crimson spot. Before either could speak, a soft metallic click echoed in the chamber. It was the sound of the door locking, though neither of them had moved toward it. Ferdinand spun around, staring at the handle, his breath quickening. Maria stepped back, her skirts whispering against the floor. The fire popped in the hearth. Somewhere in the palace, laughter and music carried faintly through the walls. But here, in the bridal chamber of the King of Spain, the air had turned cold enough to bite, and outside that heavy wooden door, someone or something was waiting. Long before the wedding night, before the gilded halls and embroidered vows, Ferdinand VII's life had been a theatre of humiliation, betrayal, and shadows. If you looked closely at his face that evening, you would not see the look of a man on the brink of love. You'd see the haunted expression of someone who had spent too many years staring into the dark. He was born into privilege, but his youth was anything but charmed. His father, King Charles IV, had ruled Spain with a strange mixture of indecision and indulgence, leaving the court vulnerable to corruption and manipulation. It was no secret that Queen Maria Luisa's favourite minister, Manuel Godoy, held more sway than was decent. The whispers in the streets accused Godoy not only of controlling policy, but of controlling the Queen herself in ways no subject should. Ferdinand grew up in this atmosphere of scandal, watching his father's throne rot from the inside. By the time he was a young man, Ferdinand was already plotting against his father's allies. In 1808, when Napoleon's armies swept across Spain, the boy prince believed fate had handed him a crown. But instead of being crowned in triumph, he found himself a prisoner spirited away to France, to the cold chateau of Valenciennes. There, for 6 long years, Napoleon kept him under lock and key, feeding him promises and then yanking them away. It was in those years of captivity that Ferdinand learned 2 things: how to smile while lying and how to suspect everyone. The French guards would deliver letters to his chambers, sometimes from supposed allies in Spain, sometimes from mysterious sources who claimed to know his destiny. He never knew which were genuine and which were traps. One letter in particular had been written in a fine, almost delicate hand. It had arrived with no seal, only the words, "Your crown will come with blood. Yours or another's." When the French finally released him in 1814, it was not into a kingdom that welcomed him with open arms, but into one splintered by war and politics. The liberal constitution of Cadiz had been proclaimed during his absence, limiting royal power. But Ferdinand, still simmering with old resentments, swept it aside, restoring absolute monarchy with a stroke of the pen. To his supporters, he was El Deseado, the desired one. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in waiting. His reign was marked by conspiracies and purges. Political prisoners filled the dungeons of Madrid, others simply vanished. Ferdinand kept a tight circle. But even among his most trusted courtiers, betrayal was currency. He once confided in a priest about his fear of assassination, only to find that his words had been repeated in the salons of the nobility within days. And then there was the matter of his first marriage. It had been a political arrangement with Princess Maria Antonia of Naples. She was young, intelligent, and most dangerously ambitious. Their union was a battlefield of cold glances and whispered threats. In 1806, she died suddenly at 21. Officially, the cause was tuberculosis. Unofficially, rumours swirled. Poison was whispered in dark corners, and Ferdinand's name was often on the lips of those telling the story. He never spoke of her death, but sometimes, late at night, attendants claimed to hear him pacing, muttering her name under his breath. The years that followed were no softer. Failed coups, assassination plots, the loss of Spain's colonies overseas, all of it left its mark. Ferdinand learned to sleep with a dagger near his bed, and to eat only from plates prepared by those whose loyalty had been tested and retested. He became a man who saw threats in every shadow. So on his wedding night with Maria Isabel, when a muffled scream rattled the edges of the room, it was not a strange sound to him. He had lived too long in a world where such things happened. But what unsettled him was that it happened here, in his private chamber, in the moment meant to seal his newest alliance. As he stood there, the smear of red on his cuff still damp, memories swarmed like flies. A night in Valencay, when the guards had dragged away a fellow prisoner, muffling his cries with a gloved hand. The time he'd awoken in the Escorial Palace to find a black cross drawn in charcoal on his bedpost. The look on Maria Antonia's face in her final hours, eyes glassy, lips moving, but the words too faint to hear. It wasn't just the scream, it was the weight of every betrayal, every warning, every whispered prophecy he had carried for decades. They had followed him into this marriage like uninvited guests. Maria Isabel, still standing by the bed, saw the change in his expression. His eyes were no longer focused on her, or the chamber. They were fixed on something much farther away, something that lived only in his mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand sharply, as if silencing a servant. Somewhere beyond the walls, the muffled roar of the city's celebrations carried on. But Ferdinand heard something else beneath it, a softer sound, like footsteps receding down a hidden corridor. A memory or a warning? He couldn't tell. For years, the king had lived with the certainty that danger would not knock at the front gates. It would slip in through a servant's entrance, creep through the corridors, and wait for the right moment. Tonight felt like that moment, and as he glanced once more at the locked door, he realized something that tightened his chest. If the past had indeed followed him into this room, it would not leave quietly. Maria Isabel sat motionless at the edge of the vast bed, her fingers clutching the folds of her gown so tightly that the silk creaked under the strain. The firelight painted her in shifting shades of gold and shadow, but nothing could hide the tension in her shoulders or the way her gaze avoided her husband's eyes. She had been raised in the Portuguese court, a place that wore civility like a mask, while venom dripped from its teeth. Behind the elaborate dances and courteous bows, she had witnessed quiet poisonings, exiles disguised as diplomatic missions, and rival factions who treated the royal family like pieces on a chessboard. By the time she was 14, Maria Isabel had learned the same lesson Ferdinand had in his own youth. Royal blood did not make you safe, it made you a target. This marriage had been planned like a military campaign. To the people, it was a union of Iberian strength, meant to heal rifts between Spain and Portugal. But Maria Isabel knew better. It was a bargain struck in secret chambers. Portugal offering her hand to keep Spanish ambition from swallowing their fragile sovereignty. She had not been given a choice. She had been given a duty. She could still hear her mother's voice on the night before she left Lisbon. Do not trust him. Ferdinand's crown sits on shifting sand, and he will let it bury you if it keeps him standing. The memory made her stomach tighten. She shifted her eyes toward Ferdinand now, watching as he paced the room like a caged animal. He was handsome in the hard, narrow way of a man who had never known comfort. But there was something else, an instability just beneath the surface, a quickness to suspicion that made every word dangerous. Maria Isabel reached into the folds of her gown and felt the small object hidden there. A delicate silver locket, warm against her palm. Inside was not a miniature portrait as one might expect, but a scrap of parchment folded into a tight square. The ink was faded, but the words burned into her memory. Your husband's enemies are not all outside his door. She didn't know who had sent it. The letter had arrived in her chamber in Lisbon just days before she set sail for Spain, placed silently on her pillow without so much as a knock on the door. She had considered throwing it into the fire, but something in the phrasing had rooted itself in her mind. And now, sitting here in this silent, locked chamber, she felt the weight of it like a stone. Ferdinand stopped pacing and looked at her sharply. You're quiet, he said, his voice edged with something between accusation and curiosity. She managed a small smile. It has been a long day, my king. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. Is it the scream that troubles you? Or is it something else? Her heart jumped, but she kept her expression still. What scream? She said, as if she hadn't heard it, as if denying it might make it disappear. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the goblet of wine on the bedside table. took a long drink, and then sat down beside her. The bed creaked under his weight. She could smell the faint scent of iron and musk on him, the smell of blood masked poorly by cologne. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then Ferdinand spoke again, his voice low. "Do you know why they call me El Deseado?" She turned her head toward him, but said nothing. "They say it means the desired one, but they don't say what is desired, peace or power or my death. Sometimes I think they mean all three." His hand brushed against hers on the bedspread, and for an instant she thought he might take it in some gesture of intimacy. Instead, his fingers closed around her wrist, not hard, but firmly enough to feel like a question without words. "You have secrets," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement. Maria Isabel's mind raced. She could tell him about the letter, about her mother's warning, about the feeling that she had been sent into this marriage like a lamb into a wolf's den. But she also knew that in this court, a secret confessed was a weapon surrendered. So she lowered her gaze, letting her silence speak for her. Ferdinand studied her for a long moment, then released her wrist and leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the door. "If you do," he murmured, "keep them close. There are people in this palace who would kill to hear them before I do." Maria Isabel felt a cold shiver move through her. She had thought of the scream as something to fear, an intrusion into their night. But now, she wondered, had it been a warning? She reached again for the locket, her fingers curling around it like a talisman. The fire burned low, and shadows stretched long across the chamber walls. Somewhere beyond the heavy wooden door, footsteps echoed briefly, then faded away. For the first time, she thought she understood what her mother had meant. This was not a wedding night. This was the first night in enemy territory. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, their light barely touching the far corners of the chamber. The air had grown colder, the kind of damp chill that seemed to seep up from the stone itself. Ferdinand lay on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the canopy above as if it might collapse on him at any moment. Maria Isabel sat in a chair by the hearth, her gown pulled around her, watching the last of the flames die. Neither spoke. Then 3 soft knocks. They were not the bold raps of a servant or guard. These were deliberate, measured, and unnervingly patient. Each one echoed faintly through the wooden panels of the door, as if whoever stood outside was in no hurry to be let in. Maria Isabel's head snapped toward the sound. Ferdinand was already sitting up, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his belt. The knocks came again 3, with the same slow rhythm. "Do not answer it," she whispered. But Ferdinand was already moving. He crossed the room in a few long strides, the floorboards under the thick carpet barely creaking. He paused with his hand on the latch, listening. "Who is it?" he demanded. Silence. He glanced back at Maria Isabel. Her face was pale, her knuckles white around the arms of the chair. Against her whispered plea, he turned the key and eased the door open. Standing in the hallway was a man whose face was obscured by a half-mask of black velvet. He wore a plain cloak, damp at the hem, as if he had come in from the night air, though no windows in this wing were open. His breathing was slow, steady. In the flicker from the chamber behind Ferdinand, his eyes glinted a pale, almost colourless grey. The man leaned forward slightly, and in a low voice he spoke a single word. It was a name. Ferdinand's expression shifted instantly from suspicion to something sharper, almost fear. The man's lips curved into a thin, humourless smile. "Tell me," he whispered. "Do you still dream of the one you lost?" Before Ferdinand could reply, the stranger slipped something into his hand, a folded scrap of parchment. Then, without another word, he stepped back into the shadows of the corridor. Ferdinand lunged forward. But by the time he reached the threshold, the hallway was empty. No footsteps, no door closing, just silence. Maria Isabel stood now, her hands trembling at her sides. Who was it? Ferdinand closed the door and locked it again, his breath uneven. He didn't answer. Instead, he unfolded the parchment. In the dying firelight, Maria could just make out the words, written in the same fine, delicate hand she had seen in her own mysterious letter. The crown will fall. The bride will be the first stone. Ferdinand crushed the note in his fist and turned toward his wife. For a moment, Maria thought he might accuse her, that his mind would leap to treachery, but he said nothing, just stood there, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. Outside, the palace was still awake. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted faintly from a distant ballroom, and the laughter of nobles echoed in the courtyard. But here, in the royal bedchamber, the celebration felt impossibly far away. Maria Isabel's mind raced. If the masked visitor had meant to kill the king, why not do it then and there? Why deliver a message instead? And why that particular warning? Why her? Ferdinand tossed the crumpled parchment into the fire, watching as the edges curled and blackened. The flames flared briefly, then died back to embers. Neither of them spoke again. But as Maria returned to her chair and Ferdinand sat on the edge of the bed, both knew the same thing. The wedding night had ended. Whatever came next would not be a union, it would be a siege. The palace by daylight was a monument to grandeur, vaulted ceilings painted with saints and angels, corridors lined with priceless Flemish tapestries, gold leaf catching the morning sun. But at night, its beauty became something else entirely. The shadows deepened into caverns. The portraits seemed to lean forward, watching. Every whisper carried farther than it should. Ferdinand knew this all too well. Since reclaiming his throne, he had learned that Madrid's royal palace was less a home than a living, breathing labyrinth of intrigue. The walls themselves seemed to hold grudges. In the days leading up to the wedding, the air had been thick with schemes. The marriage was meant to heal divisions, but instead it had stirred the waters. Factions at court shifted like sandbars, some loyal to the king, others quietly yearning for the liberal reforms he had crushed. The Portuguese alliance angered French sympathizers, and the English envoys eyed it warily, as though it might tilt the balance of power on the peninsula. And then there were the nobles. Many had worn smiles at the ceremony, but behind their jeweled fans and polite bows were sharpened ambitions. Some resented Ferdinand for the brutal purges of past years, others feared his growing paranoia. There were whispers that a clandestine network known only as La Sombra had taken root in the palace itself, made up of servants, clerks, and minor courtiers who traded in secrets like currency. Their power was not in swords but in information, and no one knew how far their reach extended. Maria Isabel, though new to the Spanish court, could feel the undercurrent. In the short hours since the masked visitor had slipped away into the corridor, she had watched Ferdinand grow more silent, more watchful. Every knock at the door, every murmur in the hallway, seemed to make him tense. She suspected the note was not his first warning, only the most recent. What she didn't know was that Ferdinand had already been told, weeks before, that there were plans to undermine him from within. The warning had come from an unlikely source. A dismissed palace physician who had claimed, over a final goblet of brandy, that certain members of the king's own household had been meeting in secret. "They say it is not enough to dethrone you," the man had said, eyes darting to the shadows of the tavern. "They say they will strip your name from history entirely, as though you never were." The words had lodged in Ferdinand's mind, poisoning every moment since. And now, on the night meant to secure his reign, someone had dared to walk straight to his door. Maria Isabel tried to piece it together. The masked man's message had been cryptic, but it was deliberate. The crown will fall. The bride will be the first stone. Did that mean she was in danger? Or did it mean she was to be used, made the weapon that would destroy him? Her instincts told her to be cautious. In Lisbon, she had seen how quickly a royal bride could become a liability. A wrong word, a suspected alliance, even a rumour could be enough to turn a marriage into a prison. She thought of the locket hidden in her gown, and the letter inside it so like the one Ferdinand had burned. A fine, delicate hand. Was it the same writer, the same faction? If so, then the message had not been meant for one of them. It had been meant for both, somewhere in the palace, perhaps only a few rooms away, The ones who had orchestrated this were waiting, not with swords drawn, but with plans already in motion. Ferdinand stood at the window, looking out over the dark gardens where lanterns still glowed from the celebration below. "They think they can frighten me," he said, almost to himself. "They think they can turn my own house against me." Maria Isabel studied him. His voice held no trace of fear, only the hard edge of a man who had been cornered before and survived. But there was something dangerous in that calm, something that made her wonder if the real threat tonight was not outside the chamber, but standing in it with her. Behind the locked doors, the fire had burned low again, the smell of charred parchment still lingering. In the corridors beyond, servants moved quietly, their footsteps soft as moth wings. Somewhere, a door shut, with a click too precise to be accidental. The palace was awake, watching, waiting, and Maria Isabel realized that whatever game was being played here had begun long before she and Ferdinand had entered this room. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Its chime was soft, almost apologetic, but it marked the moment the night shifted from unease to something sharper, something neither Ferdinand nor Maria Isabel could disguise any longer. Ferdinand turned from the window and fixed his gaze on her. The candlelight carved deep shadows across his face, catching in the lines around his eyes. He looked less like a king now, and more like a man backed into a corner. "Tell me," he said slowly, "why did you look so calm when the knock came?" Maria's breath caught. "Calm?" she repeated, her voice tight. "I was not calm. I was afraid. You were still," he pressed, stepping toward her. Too still. Not like someone surprised. Not like someone hearing that voice for the first time. She rose from the chair, holding his gaze. "And why did you not ask who it was before you opened the door? Why act as though you were expecting it?" His eyes narrowed. "Do you think me a fool? You think I do not know when something is being kept from me?" The space between them shrank. The scent of smoke from the dying fire mingled with the faint perfume on her skin, a clash of warmth and cold. Maria thought of the locket against her ribs, the folded scrap of parchment hidden inside. The words she had read in Lisbon seemed to press against her skin now, as if they wanted to be spoken. But if she told him, would it save her or seal her fate? Ferdinand's voice rose, sharp as a blade. "You came into my house, into my bedchamber, carrying secrets. You think I don't see it? You think I don't feel it?" Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to answer, her tone steady. "Yes, I have secrets, and so do you. Perhaps the same ones." He froze at that, the tension in his jaw tightening like a drawn bowstring. They stood there, two figures caught in the flickering half-light, neither willing to move first. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes. The branches of the old cypress in the garden scraped against the glass with a sound like fingernails. Ferdinand's head snapped toward the noise, and for a moment, something raw flickered in his eyes, a flash of the prisoner he had once been, listening for danger in every sound. The moment passed, but the damage was done. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand what it means to wear this crown," he said, quieter now, but no less intense. "Every smile hides a knife. Every oath is written in disappearing ink. I have seen brothers poison each other for less than what I hold." Maria's voice was low, almost a whisper. "And yet you chose to make me part of it." "Chose?" His laugh was short, humorless. "Nothing about this was my choice. You were sent here as much a prisoner as I am. Don't pretend otherwise." The words landed between them like a thrown dagger truth, but one neither wanted to acknowledge. The tension thickened until it felt like the air itself might shatter. Ferdinand turned away from her, pacing again, but now his movements were sharp, almost frantic. He muttered under his breath, half-formed sentences, names she didn't recognize. His hands clenched and unclenched as if gripping invisible throats. Maria stood rooted, watching the king unravel. Fear prickled at the edges of her mind, But beneath it was something else, a cold clarity. If this was the man she had been bound to, then she would need to know every fracture in his armor, every weakness hidden behind the crown. The thunder that had been gathering for hours finally broke, a low rumble rolling over the city. The sound seemed to shake something loose in Ferdinand. He stopped pacing, turned back toward her, and for an instant, the fury in his eyes burned so brightly that it was almost indistinguishable from fear. And Maria Isabel, in that moment, realized she was no longer certain which would be more dangerous. The storm outside had found its voice. Rain hissed against the tall windows, and the cypress branches whipped like black claws against the glass. The candles on the mantel guttered and flared, shadows leaping across the chamber walls as though the room itself were alive and restless. Maria Isabel stood near the fire, her back to the bed, listening to Ferdinand's uneven breathing. He had gone still, too still, watching the rain, his hands braced on the window frame. She could not see his face, only the rigid set of his shoulders, as though he were waiting for something only he could hear. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a slow, deliberate creak of floorboards from somewhere inside the room. Not the wind, not the furniture shifting. Steps. Maria's heart began to hammer. She turned toward the bed and froze. Something moved in the farthest shadowed corner, beyond the edge of the firelight. A shape, dark and human, stood half hidden by the heavy damask drapes. Ferdinand. Her voice was barely more than breath. He turned sharply, saw where she was looking, and in 2 strides was across the room. The figure didn't flinch, didn't run. It just stood there, watching them. And then, without a word, it stepped forward into the pale strip of moonlight filtering through the glass. The face was hidden beneath a hood, but the hand that emerged from the folds of the cloak was pale and slender, holding a dagger, whose blade caught the moonlight in a sudden, merciless gleam. Maria gasped, stumbling backward toward the hearth. Ferdinand's dagger was already in his hand. The hooded figure moved faster than seemed possible, too fast for the folds of heavy fabric, and suddenly the 2 men were locked together in the center of the chamber, steel against steel, the sound of it sharp and cruel in the air. It was not a long fight. A twist, a shove, and Ferdinand drove his attacker back against the wall. The dagger clattered to the floor, spinning once before coming to rest in the firelight. The figure sagged to the side, sliding down the paneling until it crumpled into a heap. Ferdinand stood over the body, breathing hard. His hands trembled, but whether from fear or rage, Maria couldn't tell. Then she saw it, a dark, spreading stain on the intruder's cloak. Blood, glistening black, in the half-light. For a long moment, no one moved. Rain pounded against the windows. Somewhere in the palace, a door slammed shut, and the echo rolled through the corridors like distant thunder. Maria's eyes shifted to Ferdinand's hand. The blade he still gripped was wet scarlet drops slipping down the steel to patter onto the carpet. She stepped closer, her voice shaking. Who was that?" Ferdinand didn't answer. He knelt and pulled back the hood. The face beneath was young, almost boyish, but the skin was as pale as the moonlight that framed it. A stranger. Yet something about him made Ferdinand's jaw tighten, as though recognition lingered, just beyond reach. Maria looked to the door. It was still locked from the inside. No one had come in. No one had left. The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. Ferdinand rose, his expression unreadable, and wiped the blade on the fallen man's cloak. "It doesn't matter who he was," he said finally, his voice low. "It only matters who sent him." The moon broke briefly through the clouds, spilling silver light across the chamber. It touched the blood on the carpet, turning it to a gleam that seemed almost alive. Maria couldn't look away from it. The smear trailed toward the hearth, as though the room itself had begun to bleed, and somewhere deep in the walls of the palace, muffled by stone and distance, she thought she heard it again, the same low, human cry from earlier in the night. Only this time, it didn't stop. Dawn crept slowly into the royal chamber. washing away the silver of moonlight with the pale gold of a reluctant sun. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and damp, the scent of wet earth mingling with the lingering copper tang of blood. The body was gone. Ferdinand had ordered it removed before the first light touched the windows, carried away by two silent guards who asked no questions and left no trace. The carpet had been turned to hide the stain, though nothing could hide the dark patch from Maria Isabel's eyes. Ferdinand stood before the mirror, not to admire himself, but to compose his face. The man in the reflection looked every bit a king, straight-backed, regal, unshaken. But Maria, watching from the bed, knew that the stillness was an act. She had seen the way his fingers curled slightly, as if ready to grip a dagger at a moment's notice. There was a knock at the door, not the soft, deliberate rhythm of the midnight visitor, but the brisk, formal rap of a chamberlain. "Your Majesty, the court awaits you." Ferdinand turned, his eyes briefly meeting Maria's. "Not a word," he said. She couldn't tell whether it was a plea or a command. When he stepped into the corridor, he was every inch the sovereign crown on his head, robes trailing, the weight of the Spanish monarchy on his shoulders. Courtiers bowed deeply, their faces carefully neutral. Yet Maria saw it. In the sideways glances, the whispers that died as they passed, the scent of rumour already in the air, curling like smoke. They would not speak of blood, or daggers, or midnight knocks. But something had happened in that room, and the court could feel it. Later, when Ferdinand addressed the court in the Hall of Columns, his voice carried the calm authority of a ruler in control. He spoke of unity, of alliances, of a future secured by the bond between Spain and Portugal. No one mentioned the tension in his jaw, or the way Maria's hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles shone white. And yet, in the quiet corners of the palace, servants whispered. Some claimed the king had been attacked. Others swore the bride herself was cursed, a harbinger of ruin. The more fanciful murmured that the ghost of Ferdinand's first wife had returned to claim vengeance. By the time the sun set, the story had already begun to spread beyond the palace walls. It would grow, change, and tangle itself into the long, troubled history of Ferdinand VII's reign, and for those who told it, the truth mattered less than the chill it left in the telling. For Ferdinand and Maria Isabel, the wedding night had been less a beginning than a warning. The crown still sat upon the king's head, but in the quiet moments when the halls were empty and the shadows grew long, both of them could feel it. A crown can weigh as much as a blade, and cut just as deep, and from that night onward, neither ever truly slept in the royal chamber again. If you found this story chilling, remember history hides its darkest moments in plain sight. This was just one night in the life of a king who ruled through fear, betrayal, and whispers in the dark. If you want more tales like this, stories of power, blood, and secrets that shaped the world, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment with which infamous ruler you want me to cover next. Until then, sleep well, and beware who's knocking at your door in the middle of the night.